question is that the bill be now read a second time. Mr. Saktiandi, Supaat.
Madam Speaker, first I would like to declare that I'm employed by an MAS licensed bank in Singapore. On this bill, I would like to raise some clarifications and suggestions on managing the regulatory costs or burden on market participants. These are grouped into three main areas: the need for a coherent and consistent regulatory framework, avoiding over-regulation, and guarding against unintended burdens on entities or individuals. The first area is the continuing push for a coherent and consistent regulatory framework. Our regulatory requirements should be easy to understand so that market participants do not have to waste time and cost trying to figure them out or to over-comply on the safe side. I therefore applaud the efforts to adopt a financial sector-wide regulatory approach in the consolidation of some of the MAS's regulatory powers into this one bill. My first question is whether this bill is merely the first step in a broader exercise to rationalize our regulations on a financial sector-wide basis. Will we gradually see the transposition of more pieces of our regulatory fabric into this Financial Services and Markets Act, if passed? This could allow us to surface and harmonize the possible inconsistencies between related regulations or how they are implemented. There is one part of this bill that seems to cut against a financial sector-wide regulatory approach. At Part 9 of the bill, the MAS seeks to introduce a regime to license and regulate digital token service providers based in Singapore, but who provide digital token services outside Singapore. As I understand it, digital token services providers who are providing such services in Singapore will continue to be licensed and regulated under the more extensive requirements in the Payment Services Act, the Securities and Futures Act, and/or the Financial Advisors Act. I support the implementation of the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, recommendation to ensure that virtual asset service providers are at least regulated in their home jurisdiction for money laundering and terrorist financing risks. At the same time, you should also consider other regulatory aims such as consumer protection, prudential safety, and anti-market manipulation, even for those export service providers who only provide the digital token services outside of Singapore. Even if a particular digital token service is being provided abroad, Singaporeans in Singapore may still be exposed to that digital token and its risks. For example, we may wish to subject Singapore token advisors who advertise outside of Singapore to the same restrictions that had recently been issued to digital payment token service providers regulated under the Payment Services Act. The high level of internet accessibility and connectivity that Singaporeans enjoy means that we can no longer so clearly separate what is inside and outside of Singapore. Subjecting regulated digital token service providers to the same rules, regardless of whether they are providing digital token services inside or outside Singapore, would simplify compliance for them. It would avoid the situation where a single digital token service provider is potentially subject to different legislation and regimes. However, that probably turns on the following deeper questions. Has the MAS studied crypto and virtual assets sufficiently to rationalize the piecemeal guidance it has issued to respond to specific issues, and to articulate its holistic strategy to regulate such assets? Another question that I have is whether MAS has considered carving out such export service providers from licensing and regulation under the FSMA if they are already being regulated in another jurisdiction which enforces the FATF standards at the minimum. For example, where their services are being provided. This would prevent duplicative compliance costs from having to comply with the multiple regulatory regimes, but still meet the FATF's intent to mitigate the risks of regulatory arbitrage. Madam Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the second area is to be careful not to over-regulate and stifle the financial industry. Excessive compliance burdens can cause market participants to reevaluate whether they should continue operating out of Singapore. Such offshoring not only reduces jobs and opportunities, but also hinder the development of an ecosystem in budding areas like fintech. Clause 29 of the bill empowers MAS to impose requirements of technology risk management, TRM, on any FI it regulates. Importantly, the maximum penalty for non-compliance with such TRM requirements is proposed to be $1 million plus $100,000 for every day that the offence continues after conviction to signal the importance of TRM in light of the serious effects of any potential disruption. This high penalty might have the chilling effect of discouraging FIs from working with fintech startups who typically have small operations and may not be able to invest in layered and complex cybersecurity defenses. As we are recovering from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, some have also opined that MAS should take a more supportive and facilitative approach by helping FIs scale up on TRM instead of threatening FIs with a big stick. Considering Singapore's aim to nurture a wider fintech ecosystem, including for startups, could MAS perhaps instead consider requiring any prospective licensees to present adequate cybersecurity plans as a condition to granting or renewing licenses? This was a suggestion which I had previously mooted in this House last year. Such cybersecurity plans could include risk management measures such as security audits of systems and servers and regular bounty programs to identify gaps ahead of malicious hackers, facilitating job and development opportunities for local white-hat hackers and other cybersecurity talents. Like the Personal Data Protection Commission, MAS could stipulate the existence and extent of such voluntary plans and undertakings as an additional factor to mitigate any penalty that is imposed on a regulated entity if a breach or disruption event occurs. Finally, the third area is to guard against unintended effects of our regulation, especially as the market participants find ways to shift or pass on the regulatory burden. Part 3 of the bill proposes to introduce a single harmonized power to issue prohibition orders or POs to persons to prevent them from performing particular functions in Singapore's financial sector. This will replace the MAS's existing powers to issue POs to different individuals on different grounds under different legislation. As a preliminary question, when will this new PO regime be brought into effect? And MAS's consultation response suggests that sufficient notice will be given before PO provisions are brought into effect, even after this bill passes into law. A key change is the broadened categories of persons who may be subject to POs beyond employees of FIs performing regulated functions and including the service providers of FIs. Importantly, it will be a criminal offence for the FI itself if it were to employ or use the services of a person against whom a PO is made. With the defence of taking all reasonable steps to ensure compliance and reasonable belief of compliance, allow FIs to simply shift the regulatory burden to its service providers. It would not seem fair to allow a bigger and better resourced FI to rely on its service providers' contractual warranties and covenants and effectively pass the regulatory burden to a smaller service provider who might not primarily operate in the regulated financial sector. Is the MAS intending to create and maintaining a public register of POs beyond the current publication of formal regulatory and enforcement actions taken by MAS on its enforcement actions webpage? This would make it easier for all FIs and/or their service providers to comply with the PO regime. We must also be conscious of the impact of cost to individuals who have been or may in the future be issued with a PO. Given the expanded scope for which POs may be issued, FIs may require some clarity in the form of MAS's guidance on the specific scope of POs issued in the newly extended areas. Any ambiguity could create employee deployment issues for FIs and may drive them to terminate or refrain from hiring persons who have been issued with a PO entirely. Is there any data or study on the number of persons who had previously been issued with a PO and who has thereafter returned to the financial sector? As the MAS has explicitly noted, POs materially affect individual livelihoods, and we must calibrate the impact of POs precisely. While it is important to prevent unfit persons from performing specific roles in the financial sector and to deter others from committing similar misconduct, we should ensure that those who have made mistakes are punished adequately for their errors and no more. In that vein, can I ask the Minister if an individual's previous PO can be purged from the records after a specific period of time? In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, our continued success as a financial hub will depend on how we balance the strict enforcement of integrity, competence, and financial soundness standards with the management of compliance costs. We must constantly revisit this balance to stay ahead of rapid technological and other developments and to keep our lead as a market-leading and trusted financial center. I support the bill.